real quick here, just to wrap us up, uh, you know, why don't we look forward a little bit? What do you see now with the results of the most recent election inside of Georgia, as far as the state legislature goes? Uh, where do you see gun policy moving in the state? Do you see it moving at all? I mean, you talked about earlier, there's not a lot of places left to go, right? I mean, I'm sure that gun rights advocates in the state will have ideas, right? But what do you foresee happening there?
It's hard to tell. A lot of it just depends on the climate around firearms politics. I think if things are relatively quiet, I think a lot of people are basically satisfied. I don't know we're going to see this move a lot. But my experience, I've been in Georgia for 7 years, and every single year there's something new. One year it's campus carry, the next year it's permitless carry. I think there's been a lot of fighting about restrictions on permitless carry where you're not allowed to bring your firearm in, and there may be some agitation around those things. Again, I think we've probably gone past where the sort of mainstream gun rights supporters are, which is they wanted permitted carry. They wanted, not a lot of restrictions, and they don't want a lot of money poured into the background check system. And they're not in favor of red flag laws. But, gun rights advocates seem to be wanting to push more. And I think one of the places left to push is there are restrictions on where you can carry your firearm, things that are sort of quasi-public or private venues. And what's the difference between those? And we may see sort of a greater push for example, greater clarity, your ability to take your weapon to a public event, for example, to a ball game or other places like that. I'm not sure those are such popular issues among your bedrock gun rights, voters. I think a lot of those people basically feel that they have a right to purchase a weapon now in Georgia. They have a right to carry it without a permit, unless they have some strike against them. And that basically that's what they want to do with their firearm. They want to carry it around for self-protection.
On the furthest end of the spectrum, we've seen a couple states pass Second Amendment sanctuary laws. We had the Second Amendment sanctuary movement that was more of a county-based movement, and their resolutions were sort of almost more symbolic in nature than they were legal. But since then, you've had a couple states, including Missouri, for instance, where they've passed the Second Amendment sanctuary laws that also all kind of feel symbolic in a certain sense, that they're meant to address like the potential of gun confiscation from the federal government down the line. But in practice, what they do is make it so that local law enforcement can't cooperate with federal law enforcement to enforce gun crimes unless there is an accompanying state crime for that, which in practice, most state laws do mirror federal law on, the big questions like felon in possession laws or involuntary commitments. But you have seen some of this create at least confusion, I would say, or at least, and perhaps even give maybe convenient excuses for some localities, like in St. Louis, where they had a school shooting after the shooter had failed a background check, but the St. Louis chief of police there said that they couldn't prosecute. He claimed that they couldn't prosecute the attacker after that failed background check because of this state level sanctuary law. The governor obviously disagrees. I've seen legal experts from the state that disagree with the St. Louis police as well. But obviously, it's created this situation, and so it's leading to perhaps unintended consequences like this. Do you think? But it is something that's very highly symbolic. Of course, people like the idea of, the state taking up to defend their gun rights, even in a symbolic manner. That they like that, pushing back against the federal government. I'm sure there's a lot of people who support that sort of approach. Is that something we could see in Georgia, or is it?
No, I'm sure there are people who are like that advocate this for Georgia. In Georgia, we have advocacy for whatever's going on in the national gun rights movement. There are people here in Georgia on the front lines of it. This is a very strong gun rights state. On the other hand, I think these kinds of laws play extremely poorly. I don't think they serve the gun rights movement very well. I think people, when things go sideways in these situations, when you have something like Colorado Springs, where there was a red flag law that, nobody really wanted to follow, or you have a background check that wasn't followed up because the local records aren't kept that much. You're talking often about places where tragedies occurred around firearms, and that doesn't play very well. I think most of the support for, firearms carry here is premised on the idea that there are certain categories of people who won't have access to firearms. And if what we do is we expand the right to carry and we keep a strong infrastructure in place so that people who are, pose a high risk, people with mental illness, criminal records, the kind of people nobody wants toting guns around, we're probably going to continue to see continued support for gun rights. If we can, if we expand the right to carry and then we have a general lack of enforcement around the kinds of controls to make sure that the people who are at high risk for carrying out criminal misuse of the weapons, we don't have that kind of infrastructure, or local officials decide that they just don't want to be involved in enforcing those laws, I think that's going to erode support. And I actually think that's probably a tactical mistake. My sense is that mainstream players in firearms rights probably know this. And I think that a lot of what the appeal holds is it's really part of a larger package of the rule of law. I think the left has tried to paint gun rights as a kind of lawless, Waco self-help movement. And in fact, I think your average Georgia voter who is in favor of gun rights is a person who also believes very deeply in the rule of law. That's probably one reason why it is that they favor Kemp marginally over, Trump-backed candidates, is that for gun rights advocates in the mainstream, this is all a package. It's all a package about your individual right to own a firearm and the rule of law and respect for law and a system that will make sure that firearms are not getting into the wrong hands. So I think these sort of movements, it's a little on the left, like immigration sanctuaries, the idea of people sort of thumbing their nose at the rule of law and saying, well, we'd like an exception because we don't really want to go along with the pack. That just doesn't play well for immigration rights. And people who are generally sympathetic start to sort of peel off at that point. So I think that probably would be a tactical mistake here in a place like Georgia.
That's interesting. And so if that is, in fact, the majority of these sort of Georgia gun voters that exist, do you think the legislature recognizes that and wouldn't push towards, this sort of Second Amendment sanctuary, or even something like this sort of attempted nullification laws regarding silencers and suppressors that you've seen in places like Texas and Kansas?
I think you might see local initiatives. There's clearly a variation across Georgia about people's attitudes towards the federal government and in some sense the rule of law when it doesn't go their way. But I think the Georgia legislature generally tries to cleave off the extremes, both on the left and the right, and to trot a kind of more moderate path. We had a long-term Speaker of the House here who recently passed away, 20 years heading the legislature, and he was famous for getting things through, things like religious liberty and firearms laws, gun rights laws. And that was largely because he was able to trim off at the edges to make sure that, people felt generally comfortable in the mainstream with these. And I think that the people running the Republican Party in Georgia, who are right now controlling the state house and the governor's office, I think these are people who understand that they don't want to go fringe. They want to basically maintain the positions that they've staked out. And I think permitless carry may be something that doesn't have a majority of supporters, but it doesn't seem to me like a crazy fringe idea. I think the idea of basically saying that you're not going to enforce the background check regime is probably something you're going to start to see people peeling off about.